Hi, it's Jim, and today's notes are on our discussion on Melville's short story Bartleby the Scrivener. It's what is today? Today's Wednesday the 25th, and I just came out of class, so everything's kind of fresh in my mind and probably all over the place as well. We had a great discussion today. Did just a little bit of creative quick writes at the end of the class, and I'll talk about that when I'm done here. Bartleby the Scrivener is a story from the latter half of the 19th century, the 1800s, by Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. That was his most famous work. And Bartleby the Scrivener is a curious essay, or a curious short story in many different ways. As everybody in class said, it's a mystery. We're really not sure what Bartleby means when he says, "I would prefer not to." We're not sure what his backstory is, or if we can trust what the narrator says about him at the very end of the story. And we're also not sure if we can trust what the narrator says. So just to reiterate what we did first off in class is we just went through and talked about the broad outlines of Bartleby the Scrivener. The story starts with the narrator talking about himself. He calls himself an elderly man, although he's only in his late 50s, early 60s. And he is a lawyer who doesn't like confrontation. He prefers not to argue things in court, he tells us, but instead runs a business where he copies legal documents and makes sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed. And does that for equity for various rich people and firms that have equities. He calls himself unambitious, which is kind of a curious thing as well. He doesn't want to be in the limelight. Instead, he seems, frankly, kind of lazy in many ways. So, he's a unique perspective. And it sets him up for his failures in the way that he deals with his employee, Bartleby the Scrivener. But before we even get to Bartleby the Scrivener, the next thing, after describing himself, that the narrator tells us is the names of his other employees. He has 3 people working for him. The youngest, Ginger Nut, is a 12-year-old apprentice who seems sort of the gopher in the place. And then he has 2 men, Nippers and Turkey, one of whom is a good employee in the morning, but then seems to go away for lunch and comes back red-faced. The implication is that he drinks on his lunch a great deal. And for the second part of the day, he blots ink on the contracts and on the documents that he copies and is basically angry and unable to do very good work. The other man, the younger man, is terrible in the morning, but when he comes by after the lunch is over, he's able to concentrate and pick up for his other employee. So it sort of balances these things out. But again, what's really important is the narrator, the owner of this business, chooses not to confront either of these 2 men over their shortcomings. He doesn't tell them he wants them to change how they behave. Instead, he says, well, in the afternoon, yeah, this guy's bad, but that's when his other the worker ends up shining. So rather than fix problems, our narrator tends to punt them down the road. He is passive-aggressive. Well, it turns out that he gets another job working as the head of the chancery. This is the court that decides a lot of legal matters when it comes to equities and to ownership of deeds. And so he has to hire a third person. And the third person that he hires is the guy who gives us the title for the story, Bartleby the Scrivener. A scrivener is a person who just copies by hand law documents. And that's what the whole business ends up doing. This is before the days of Xerox and copy machines. So it's important that they copy everything exactly as it's written, and then store it away in case there's an appeal to a case or something has to be further litigated. So at last we get to Bartleby the Scrivener, this new employee who comes in. At first, We're told that he does a wonderful job, that the narrator's never seen anybody as good at scrivening as Bartleby is. Everything seems fine until one day the narrator asks Bartleby to come in and help do a group check of one document. Everybody's going to be looking at the same document, different copies of the document, and comparing them to the original. At that point, Bartleby simply says, "I would prefer not to." And this becomes the refrain that he uses for all kinds of requests from his boss. He doesn't give a reason why. He doesn't say, "I've got a headache today," or "I'm suffering from a migraine," or "my eyes are bad." It's just, "I would prefer not to." Not even, "I won't do it." "I would prefer not to." As the story goes on, we find out there are other quirks to Bartleby's personality. He apparently has been living in the office when everybody else goes home. He sleeps under his desk, and eventually gets to the point where he says, "I would prefer not to everything that the narrator asks." Almost like the bird in Poe's The Raven, who just says, "Never more, never more, never more." For Bartleby, it's, "I would prefer not to." So, if you were a boss and you had an employee like this, what do you think you'd do? You'd probably fire him, right? You might try to get him to change his behavior, and the narrator does try some things, but nothing seems to work. And at that point, today's boss would simply fire him. And in fact, our narrator does says, "I don't need you anymore. Please vacate the premises." And Bartleby just simply says what he always says, "I would prefer not to." Eventually, the narrator comes upon what he thinks is the best solution. Simply find a new office. "I'm going to take my employees, I'll get a new place, and we'll move out, and Bartleby will be kicked out by the next person to come by." And in that action, you see just how passive-aggressive the narrator is. Unable to solve the problem himself, he kicks it down the road to somebody else. Should be the end of the story, we'd assume, but things go on. You've read the story, so you know what happens. Eventually, Bartleby ends up taken away by the police and put in a place called the Tombs in Manhattan. This was an old prison. The narrator seems to be feeling some sort of guilt because he goes and sees Bartleby twice. The second time, Bartleby is dead when he arrives. So that's the basic story. Those are the outlines of the story. And I had a series of questions in that I gave to the small groups to look at and to discuss. And I'm just going to sort of run through these quickly and tell you some of the things they came up with. Before introducing Bartleby, the narrator introduces us to the other three workers, Turkey, Nippers, and Gingernut. What are they like? I think I've already described them. How does the narrator's response to them and the way that he puts up with their faults shape the reader's reaction to what follows? Well, it means that we believe that the narrator's acting the way he usually acts, passive-aggressive, unable to confront things. He's an unambitious man, as he says. The exact opposite of what we expect from a lawyer on Wall Street. It's very different times. How does the lawyer describe Bartleby as he first appears? He says he's pallid, lacking color, seems to be kind of dour, but otherwise does a good job at first. I asked the question, does Bartleby change? Is he a dynamic character or is he static? And most of the class said that he was static. There's not much change that comes from inside, only what other people make him do. And then I asked the question, is the narrator static or dynamic? Everybody sort of thought about that for a while and tended to say he's kind of dynamic. He changes because of his relationship with Bartleby, but not completely. It's not an overwhelming change. Which led me to ask the next question, is this a story about Bartleby the Scrivener? That's who it's named after all. Or is it about our narrator? And everybody sort of agreed it's more about the narrator. One of the main themes is in this story is, what is our ethical obligation to other people? And in a business, what is our ethical and moral obligation to the people that we employ? Melville's asking questions that are more 21st century than 19th century at this point. They're things we are interested in. And I think we get a sense that the narrator is guilty because he does feel a moral obligation to try to help Bartleby and to figure out what exactly is this mystery around Bartleby. He's just unable to do it because everything he tries fails miserably. The passive aggressiveness, though, I think also suggests that the one thing that he doesn't try is really harsh, direct confrontation. Might be what Bartleby needs more than anything else, not just this passive, here's a coat, I'll give you some money. Instead, it needs to get in his face and find out what the problem is, and if he can't fix it, hook him up with somebody who can. Today, we'd send him to a psychiatrist, or we'd bring in outside help, a counselor, somebody who could try to work with him and make him I don't want to say solve him, but heal whatever it is that's going on. You'd have everybody in the office confront him and say, this is why your behaviors are not acceptable. The next question was, there are numerous mentions of the word wall in this story. What's the symbolism of it? This is called a story of Wall Street, and it's set on Wall Street. Wall Street itself was once surrounded by the old Dutch wall around the island of Manhattan, and so that's how it got that name, Wall Street. But in our story, the office that they're in is, what would you say, almost like a cavern. It's called a snug, a very small cavern. You feel claustrophobic in there. One window looks out on another wall, wall of bricks. The other, all you can see is a little bit of light from high up above. But, it's a street with lots of very tall buildings that are close together. And more than anything, you feel this sense of claustrophobia. And maybe that's part of the theme of this as well, that the people are walled in, that business has penned them in here, and they don't sense any sort of freedom whatsoever. They work 6 days a week. They work deep into the night. They are constrained from having individual personalities that are rewarding in some ways. The work becomes everything. And so a lot of critics see this as a criticism of American capitalism as it's developing in the late 19th century. So Wall Street is being condemned here, as well as the way that we place walls between ourselves and other human beings. At the end, the narrator says that Bartleby is sleeping with kings and counselors. I asked a group, what does this mean? Why might Wall Street have had a role in his demise? What's the significance of the story's final words, humanity? All these questions, we really didn't have great answers for, other than the idea that Bartleby represents something. It represents a human being in trouble, crying out for help, who gets no help whatsoever, who's sort of left to fester away in prison because he can't conform to what society expects of him. He's sleeping with kings and counselors. We all shook our head at that. It's the kind of thing you say when somebody's buried, that they're like kings and counselors. Death makes us all equal, and that's sort of what happens at the very end. And that's it. That's sort of the last question there. The story is mysterious. The critics don't agree on what it means. It's a fun one to write about because you have to postulate things and build arguments for them. To me, it always comes down to that question: do we take what happens at the very end of the story as being the answer to the riddle that is Bartleby or not? At the very end, the narrator says he found out a few months after Bartleby died that his former job had been in the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., burning letters that couldn't be delivered for whatever reason. And for the narrator, this represents the worst of all possible jobs. You take letters that are often, loans to people who are desperate for money, or protestations of love, or asking for forgiveness, or communication. Again, the thing that doesn't happen in Bartleby's office. Communication is impossible when all you'd answer back is, I would prefer not to. The narrator thinks this is shaped by him being in the place where all he can look at is the final communication of somebody that then is burned because there's nowhere for it to go. He sees this as sort of both symbolic and the actual thing that sent Bartleby over the edge. Of course, at the same time that he says this, he tells us he can't remember who told him this. He doesn't know if it's true or not. He's not sure if that's really what shaped Bartleby. So we're left with even more mystery than what we had before. No easy answers in Bartleby the Scrivener. This is the case for much of Melville's writing. The last thing that we did in class is we picked up where we left off in the quick write on Monday. You're beginning to work on a short story. Remember in the last one I had you draw the map of your childhood home and put in stories that operated there. You can go to the quick write section in Canvas and you can read what I wanted you to do today, which is sort of start identifying what story you want to tell and beginning to fictionalize it. I just want to point out that these are not autobiographies. They are fictional. So whatever story you want to tell about the time you fell off the bike, do what you want to with it. Give your character a name. It's not necessarily you. Give them whatever backstory you need and start thinking about what you can do to make the story come alive, to make it more interesting, whatever you want to do. If you want to have the person fall off the bike because a purple unicorn came out and blew smoke in your face, you can do that. Or if you want it to be because your younger sister ran out in front of you and you end up veering to the left to end up not hitting her and instead you go out into the traffic, you can do that. Do whatever you want to. This is your story. Start fictionalizing it. Read what I wrote in the quick write section, and I'll see you in class on Monday. Thanks.